still a kind of affirmation in a certain kind of way. So all these films, to just sum up, I think are exploring social regimes of both actually existing socialism and actually existing capitalism, and are, having a negativity about their limits, which is something we don't get very much even in the most critical Western American or Western European films. And their perspective, which to me, as an American in 2010 is kind of alien, is nonetheless sort of offering at least slight prospects or some way of thinking maybe something different, and thus responding to this powerlessness of the imagination which I started out with. And again, I'm really only, much of this I haven't written out yet, which is why I was sort of giving you plot summaries with a few key points. And once I do it, probably each of these films would be itself worth a full talk. So I apologize for spending so long. Just have one conclusion. This is really just a quote which I found, which I think epitomizes what I'm trying to work towards. In 1968, in May 1968, when there was this big uprising of students, workers, and others in France, which the Situationists had a great part in, one of the slogans, one of the many ecstatic far-out slogans was, "Be realistic, demand the impossible." That was sort of the old-style utopianism, which is sort of unthinkable now. Aninda Bhattacharya, who's a British journalist and political activist, sort of suggested in his blog a couple years ago, reversing the slogan, "Be unrealistic, demand the possible." And this goes back to my initial question about saying that we can imagine apocalyptic destruction better than we can imagine just something which would make life slightly more humane and pleasant. There are a lot of things which, the world is wealthy enough that nobody has to starve. There are a lot of things which are possible. There is, but which we're told by politicians and financiers are unrealistic. It's unrealistic to think that we can sustain higher education at the level it's been done in the past. It's not impossible. It's not something utopian in the sense. It's something which we have the resources for, but we certainly don't have the political will for. And it's something which is defined as from the get-go as totally unrealistic. So this is the kind of inverted utopianism which I'd like to be able to imagine, and which maybe these films help us think about a little bit. So I apologize for going so long, and thank you.
If there are any questions, we can stay in the room even though it's past 5 o'clock, so I will do that. So,
question about the first film, Taxidermy.
Yeah.
So one of the questions that the film leaves open is whether or not all of the men are related, as you kind of broken up, because the women have these extramarital.
Yeah.
So how do you see that as a reflection, or what's the commentary in terms of the political systems that you are exploring in this section of the film?
Okay, well, I think that just has to do with the general fact of the film. Besides being a political film, it's also a crisis of masculinity film.
Mm-hmm.
The film offers 3 totally different portraits, but all of completely dysfunctional and collapsed masculinity. Mm-hmm. And it does in such a way that it sort of suggests or implies that there isn't a counterturn of normative masculinity as a positive thing. One thing I actually find refreshing of the film is that it doesn't, unlike most American films, it doesn't posit a kind of positive, healthy normative masculinity in any possible way. All we have are these dysfunctions. And these dysfunctions, have to do with the weird fetishes, if you want to call that, which all 3 generations have. And they also have to do, I think, with the fact that this whole thing about paternity, which is some important part of the patriarchal order, is continually thrown into question. So I'm not saying that there's a kind of philosophical thing in which the stuff about masculinity neatly links up with all the stuff about the political regimes, but it seems pointing to me that all 3 political regimes make nonsense of a kind of normative masculine and patriarchal kind of order and descendants. Back here?
I was hoping you might speak a little bit about the way in which this quote and its question of what is realistic and what is not realistic plays into the choices of the filmmakers in terms of their subject matter, and
Mm-hmm.
that neither one of them seems to lean towards the kind of mundane but perfectly possible and desirable
Yeah.
outcomes of the kinds that you're mentioning, like fully funding higher education or
Yeah.
something like that.
Sure.
How is it that you see these films leading us to a kind of unthinkable but perfectly possible set of?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. I think, okay, this is something which I should have brought out, which, it's a question that has to do with the relation of, exploring transgression and exploration of extremes, which has been a big thing in, in art and culture for the modernism, for the entire 20th century and into today, to this question of, absolute revolution versus, making changes. In a certain sense, a lot of 20th century, both art and political agitation is very transgressive, and this fits into, I was throwing these different senses of utopianism, and how I didn't want to say, well, any effort change means that's utopian and that's impossible because of human nature, and therefore, but all these films are in different ways exploring, the extremity, and they come to maybe different conclusions about it than many more Western films do. I was originally asked to write about taxidermia as part of a collection of essays about, it's now going to appear in a different place, but originally it was for essays dealing with the sort of, there's been a lot of talk recently about new cinema of extremity. If you think of things like, it's a worldwide phenomenon. Things like Gaspar Noé's Irreversible, which deals with a very horrific and traumatic rape. If you think of some of the films of Takashi Miike, which are utterly horrific in a completely unredemptive way, and there are other examples of films which are of sort of now art house extreme cinema, and these superficially both taxidermy and Life and Death of the Porno Gang fall into this category. But in fact, I think they're doing something different because they have a very different perspective about transgression. In a certain sense, they aren't transgressive in the way we've come to expect, and there's a whole dialectic around transgression, and transgression falls back to that which is transgressing against, and you push the extremity, because extremity can only be death, and so on, and so forth. That's, in a weird way, that's questioned in all three of these films. In Taxidermia, because of the way these bodily extremes are tied to these three social regimes and to the failures of being trapped within them. In WR, because again, that very modernist quest as a film from 1971 is very much tied in with a vision of emancipation which is never realized, and which actual regimes of power and privilege and inequality can sustain. In the third film, because you see this in this slippage here, you see the slippage from the kind of naive young filmmaker, we're going to do something really edgy and transgressive, we're going to go beyond all limits. That's kind of his ambition. But when you see but then when he gets confronted with what really is doing this, it's something which is completely tied in with capitalizing, media capitalism, making money, and perpetuating all kinds of things. So in a certain sense, the transgressiveness, which is when you think of films like Irreversible, and I'm blanking on the names of there's lots of films like this. Some of them are very interesting, but it seems to me what differentiates these films is that they're not making this, they refer to the same aesthetic, but they're turning it inside out, or they're undoing it in a certain way. And again, I have to prove this, especially with Porno Gang, by a longer analysis of the film, which I've just barely begun doing. But that's sort of what I'm thinking, and somehow, again, I'd like to connect that up to my general ideas about, they're offering us not so much a different political vision, but as a different economy, understanding economy both in the monetary sense, but also in the kind of libidinal or affectional sense. Yeah.
Maybe I missed it, but were these award-winning movies?
No. Taxidermia.
Because that would be the one I would.
These are, the two recent movies are not very well known still.
Okay.
Taxidermia came out in 2006. It showed at some film festivals in Europe. It came out on DVD only in the past 8 months or so in the U.S. Life and Death of the Porno Gang has been shown at some festivals in the U.S., Canada, and Western Europe. They've all been like sort of horror film festivals, fantastic film festivals. Film festivals about horror films, stuff like that. So they, even though they're clearly not really horror films, though they are, they do have pretty horror stuff. Porno Gang. There's another film which is also very interesting. I think it's called a Serbian film, which is even more kind of distasteful than Porno Gang and what it depicts, but which is also, and which is also, you know, I mean, it has really ugly, grotesque stuff, and it's hard to watch, even for me, but I mean, it sort of positions this both in kind of campy excess and the kind of hallucinatory derangement, and in terms of this is what the West wants to see Serbians as these primitives, so this is what they're paying for, kind of thing. So it's a similar, I don't think it's as good a film, it's a similar gesture. And so so those films, the one film I said which is well known is W.R. Mysteries, The Organism, which hit the art film circuit in the West in the 70s, and which is a much, you know, very canonized and much written about film. It's with the two recent ones, and so no, none of these, but the two recent ones certainly haven't been internationally acclaimed or won prizes. They still have a kind of marginal status. Yeah.
I had just a general question about your methodology.
Yeah.
And about the difficulty of working with and writing about films that are in languages that
Yeah.
you don't read or
Mhm.
understand.
Yeah.
Could you talk to us a little, because we could see, you know, the lines of
Yeah.
text, and yet there's a lot more going on.
Yeah,
Could you
sure.
talk to us a little bit about
Well, again, I think that's a difficulty which I acknowledge and try to work around with. I mean, there really is a problem, which is that, you know, these are all the main languages which aren't spoken by large numbers of people. And most of the writing about films from Hungary or from Yugoslavia or ex-Yugoslavia or Serbia have come from people who know the languages and are familiar with the culture. So there's always a risk you're missing something. You're certainly missing some dimensions of language. You're also probably missing certain dimensions of contextual knowledge. So I'm the first to admit that I try to supplement it by reading judiciously, but I'm the first to admit that yes, I think it's kind of a risk or a difficulty. I think it's worth doing because of the other things that you get from it, and I mean, I really don't want to ignore the films. So in a certain sense, I am admitting a certain non-expertise and doing it from certain, but I'm trying to factor the awareness of that outside perspective into what I'm writing about it, which is precisely why I'm trying to say that I'm seeing this film from there's a kind of multiple displacement. There's a displacement between, you know, before and after in these countries, and there's a displacement of me or us watching them from a totally different social situation without knowing the languages or knowing enough about the history. I mean, it's negotiated in different ways. I mean, WR is partly in English and partly in Serbian, or Serbo-Croatian as it was called then, and it makes some reference to the United States as well. The other two films, you know, are national films. I don't know any Hungarian at all. I know, I studied Serbo-Croatian for a little while, so I know a little bit, but not enough to really catch more than a few words. But, you know, they're all dealing